Good afternoon and welcome to the GMC annual membership meeting. I'm David Lubar, chair of the GMC. We have several guests I'd like to welcome today, including representatives from Milwaukee Women, Inc. and 3 new members to the GMC. Patrick Rath, who is president and CEO of the United Performing Arts Fund. PJ DeStefano, managing partner at Deloitte. And Jim Schwallen, Senior Vice President of West Bend Mutual Insurance. We have a full agenda today, so I'd like to jump right in and turn the mic over to Julia Taylor for updates on the GMC initiatives. Julia?
Thank you, David, and hello and welcome to the annual meeting. As a reflection of the virtual world that we've been living in 2020, the GMC has released its first ever virtual annual report to showcase what happened in 2020. We designed the piece as a commercial corridor organized by virtual buildings that symbolize the GMC's work and reflect the importance of healthy, equitable communities. We will send a digital link to this report to all of our members, and we encourage you to actively share it with your partner networks. And in some more updates, in innovation and talent, the GMC and the Commons continue our partnership with the Home Group for a second cohort of Forward 48, scheduled for March 24th. We are looking for diverse rising leaders in your organization, ideally aged 25 to 40. The first cohort was an equal mix of gender and race, and we aim for a similar level of diversity again. And additionally, we welcome an exceptional and diverse faculty to facilitate the curriculum, including Tonic Calloway, Gail Klappa, Representative Gwen Moore, Corey Nettles, Euless Payne, Mary Ellen Stanek, and Jeff Yabuki. The cost is $2,000 per participant. Reach out to Michael Hostad or Isabel Sandretti at the GMC for more information or to nominate a participant. And in economic prosperity, Scale Up Milwaukee is set for a busy 2021 with plans to host a virtual growth accelerator from June to November to support businesses that are in the $1 million to $15 million range in annual revenue. We will also host 2 virtual Spark cohorts in spring and fall to support businesses owned by women and people of color with revenues of less than $1 million. Scale Up was built on a growth mindset culture, but many of these small businesses were fearful for the future when the pandemic hit. Scale Up Milwaukee has helped many make it through the pandemic and guided these companies to continued growth in 2021. We're pleased to share that Milwaukee United has completed another round of the Anti-Displacement Fund. Last year, the fund supported 111 homeowners with a total of $38,356 dispersed. In the second year of the fund, we helped 116 homeowners with $88,000 made in tax payments. The increase in the payments, which more than doubled this year, is due to the continued rise in property assessments and tax valuations in the neighborhoods that are proximate to the downtown development. As we continue to see investments in both the neighborhoods and downtown, we must ensure that long-term residents can benefit from these investments and are not displaced. In the vibrancy of place, in January, we began the feasibility study process for the Beerline Trail Park expansion. We are currently finalizing the interview list for the study and plan to start the interviews in March. Finally, the Urban Institute is studying the equity impact of the Beerline Trail and Milwaukee's night market. We will share the findings when the report is released. And now I would like to invite Dr. Raymond, President of the Medical College of Wisconsin, to provide us with the latest COVID information. Dr. Raymond?
Thanks, Julia. Always an honor to be here with my colleagues. I'm going to talk today about the usual metrics, but not in as much detail as usual so that you can take this away and try to focus on vaccines toward the second half of my talk. If I could go to the next slide, please. This is an overview of testing in Wisconsin. Nearly 3.1 million people have been tested in Wisconsin at least once, out of a population of 5.83 million. So more than half of us have been PCR tested for COVID-19 at least once since last March. Almost 9% of the population has tested positive at 550,000. And undoubtedly, there are others who were not tested who did have COVID-19. Similar trends in Milwaukee with nearly 500,000 tested and almost 100,000 positive since the beginning of the pandemic. If I can go to the next slide, please. Yesterday was a relatively light day compared to what we were experiencing in the late autumn and early winter. 672 positive cases in Wisconsin, 119 here in Milwaukee. Case positivity remains high, with 14.8% in Wisconsin yesterday and 17% in Milwaukee yesterday, with the 7-day averages remaining over 20%. And again, we'd like to see those averages be significantly below 5%. Nevertheless, there's a clear deceleration in terms of new cases, hospitalizations, and finally, a downward trend in deaths. Next slide, please. We've had almost 25,000 people hospitalized with COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. And again, the trend is downward now, with 570 inpatients reported as of yesterday from a previous high of nearly 2,300 in mid-November. ICU census also is declining at 144, and that's down week over week by 24 patients. Nevertheless, during the summer, we were enjoying ICU censuses of between about 60 and 100 on average, so we're still much higher than we were last summer. We have a good amount of ICU beds available, 285, but that also is lower than what we were experiencing during the summer, when we typically were running in the upper 300s to low 400s in terms of availability in Wisconsin. As I've said before, we have plenty of ventilators, and unlike early in the pandemic when many people with COVID-19 were being intubated, we're not doing that now to patients. We've learned that we're doing everything we can to keep people from being on ventilators, and that capacity has hovered around 2,000 on a daily basis, so we'll never exceed that. And our personal protective equipment trends are still fragile, but they have stabilized and are starting to improve from the tenuous situation that we were experiencing in November. Next slide, please. Deaths, we're over 6,000 deaths in Wisconsin from COVID-19 now at 6,054, and we're approaching 1,200 deaths in Milwaukee. These are deaths that are not reported by the medical examiner, whose counts typically are lower by about 150 or 200, but still the trend is pretty similar to the rest of the state per capita population. Again, COVID-19 deaths disproportionately represent males over females, and African Americans in particular over Caucasians. Now, it's interesting, Latinx and Hispanic individuals are more likely to get COVID-19 than other demographics, but less likely to be hospitalized and slightly less likely to die. We're not sure we understand all of the dynamics that go into that, but it may be that typically you're talking about a younger population in the Latinx community, but that remains to be seen. So just in terms of excess mortality compared to cases, African Americans and Native Americans have the predisposition to bad outcomes. As you can see in Milwaukee, similar trends, although we have a larger Black population here, we still are overrepresented in terms of African American deaths. Next slide, please. Some good news here just in terms of trends, and this shouldn't be surprising if you're following the decline in case counts, hospitalizations, and deaths. The doubling time is starting to extend outward again, which is good news. Almost 60 days in Wisconsin and 93 days in Milwaukee. But what that means is if things don't change in Wisconsin, 59 days from now, we'll have another 500,000+ new cases. So we need that doubling time to go out even farther. 7-day growth rate, same trends, favorable, 0.2% in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. But again, you're talking about a very large case burden to begin with. So we want that number to go even lower. And the reproductive number, which many of you focus on as a measure of contagiousness, it's an early marker of the trend in COVID-19 and the pandemic, has been below 1 now for almost 3 weeks, and it's at 0.9 in Wisconsin and 0.9 in Milwaukee. That's relatively stable. We'd really like that number to be below 0.5. And again, to remind people what that measures, 0.9 means that any person who has COVID-19 during the course of their illness passes it on to 0.9 other people on average. So that means that we are having a deceleration, but it's not as slow as we'd like it to be. Also want to call your attention to the lower right-hand side of the slide in the green bar. 1.1% of patients diagnosed with COVID-19 in Wisconsin have died since the beginning of the pandemic. And this is important for several reasons. First of all, this is about half of the death rate in the United States. I think part of that is that we never completely overwhelm the capacity of our health systems to render the best care to everybody, although we came very close in mid-November. Other states had at least one, in some cases two surges that did overwhelm that capacity. So this is something to bear in mind. Also, we were hovering at about 0.8% in October and November. And remember, deaths lag 5 to 6 weeks after new diagnoses. And I think what we're seeing is the residual impact of having our hospitals filled up in November. Next slide, please. I want to talk about vaccines. A lot of activity. I actually had to change my slides twice, once last night and once this morning, because the activity is going fast and furious. What we know is that there are 2 vaccines that have been approved under emergency use authorization in the US. Those are shown on the left as Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. They're both using a relatively new technology. It's been around 20 years, but has never been mass produced. So there is an issue with the supply chain. This is messenger RNA technology. So what we know is that Pfizer and Moderna, even though these are very safe and very effective vaccines, are going to have difficulty ramping up to the hundreds of millions of doses that we're going to need to vaccinate everyone in the country. Moving to the right-hand side of the slide, there are 3 players that are likely to enter the market here in the US in the next month to 2 months. And those are Johnson & Johnson with their 1-dose regimen, AstraZeneca, and Novavax. Johnson & Johnson did apply for emergency use authorization last Friday, and the advisory committee for the FDA will take up their application on February 26th. I expect full approval and a pretty quick rollout. They have promised, because this is a more mature technology with turnkey manufacturing capacity, that they could have hundreds of millions of doses available in the US before the end of the year, and probably could ramp up even faster. AstraZeneca, I had a lot of hopes. This is the Oxford vaccine that's being distributed in the UK, that this would be the next market entrant after Johnson & Johnson. Unfortunately, there are some issues with the emerging strains and with the elderly that may make this not the best vaccine for going forward in the future, and they may need to tweak it with some modifications like we typically do with the seasonal flu vaccine. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the concerns about that AstraZeneca vaccine going forward. We're not hearing much about Novavax. Uses the same kind of technology. It's an adenovirus or modified cold virus that they use to introduce the genetic snippet of the COVID-19 virus into the human being to make the antigen. That's a US company that's very close to approval in Europe. I'm expecting that they'll also want to get approval here in the US, and they do have secured manufacturing capacity both in the US and in India. Next slide, please. Now, I just took a screenshot from the Department of Health Services website. You can track how many vaccines have been promised or allocated by the federal government to Wisconsin. It's nearly 1 million now. We have ordered 770,000 and have administered 761,000 vaccines. Some are in transit, and these categories don't necessarily completely overlap with each other because of the pharmacy program to get vaccines into nursing homes. Also have some good news about vaccinations. A few weeks ago, there was a lot of concern, hand-wringing, even some finger-pointing about what was called the slow rate of rollout of vaccinations in Wisconsin. I talked about some of the reasons for that, but I'm happy to report now that at least 10% of the Wisconsin population has received at least 1 dose of COVID-19 vaccine. So our capacity over the last few weeks has ramped up significantly. 164,000 people in Wisconsin have completed the series, and that's 2.8% of our population. Also, some good news here. Even though we want to compare ourselves to best in breed, which is West Virginia, which is at about 5.8% of the population having completed their series, we're ahead of our peer states in the region for the most part. So Illinois is 2.24 percent of the patient population that have completed their series. Iowa's 2.56, Minnesota's 2.63. So we're ahead of those. The only state that we're slightly behind in our region is Minnesota at 2.85% of the population having been vaccinated. And even more good news in the journal Sentinel this morning, compared to other states, Wisconsin is #1 in terms of the number of vaccines administered per million people or population per day. So we've surged into the lead, and I think that's really important. And in fact, last week, the Department of Health Services estimated that if we could only get enough vaccine here to Wisconsin, we had the capacity in our clinics to vaccinate and complete the series for all Wisconsin residents by June. So this has become a supply chain issue and perhaps a vaccine hesitancy issue in terms of acceptance of the vaccine. So I can go to the next slide, please. I'm only going to just briefly mention that the federal government identified 4 different phases of rollout of the vaccines in December. These are constantly being modified. So in Wisconsin, we're still finishing phase 1A, and we have selectively activated phase 1B populations. And these would include frontline personnel such as fire, EMS, and police. Those were authorized to start January 18th. Also, we're directing some vaccine doses to Native American tribes and reservations. And even though we have authorized 75 plus years of age, it's really 65 plus in practice in Wisconsin. And we do expect March 1 that we're also going to be able to extend vaccine eligibility to teachers and postal workers and other people and grocery store workers, other people whose jobs require them to work face-to-face with many people. But again, we really need to have vaccine doses to be able to expand that eligibility effectively. Next slide, please. On the right is a screenshot from the Wisconsin DHS showing that we do have increasing numbers of vaccinations going as we go forward from the left, which was mid-December, to the right, which was yesterday. And we're having a larger proportion of Moderna vaccine doses, which makes it easier to push those doses out into community clinics, doctors' offices, and pharmacies, because that vaccine is less fragile than the Pfizer vaccine. So the Moderna vaccine is shown in purple bars, the Pfizer vaccine in the orange/tan bars. Going to the left-hand side of the slide, I did want to make sure that our slow start in part was because we have a higher proportion of 1A individuals in Wisconsin as a percentage of our population than other states. We have more nursing home residents and more healthcare personnel. So that was why we were a little bit slower than, say, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, in allowing some selected 1B populations to receive the vaccine. But as I mentioned, we're catching up very quickly. I had already mentioned the rest of the statistics on the left-hand side of the slide. But again, really good news on the top right. Wisconsin now leads the US in daily doses administered per million population. So that's really terrific news. The next slide, please. Now, early vaccine experiences and findings, and this is particularly important for vaccine hesitant populations. And in particular, I'm talking about African American and Black communities in our region. There have been no indications of severe or negative outcomes related to the COVID and either of the COVID-19 vaccines that are approved for use in the US. And I expect the same for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine when it's eventually approved. Also, these anaphylactic events or severe allergic reactions that were highlighted very early in mid-December when we were doing the rollout really aren't as much of a problem as we had feared. Really, the incident rate is low, like 5 per million for these vaccines. And anaphylaxis is easily dealt with by qualified healthcare professionals who can give epinephrine and a steroid and a histamine 2 blocker. And we're still monitoring people after getting the vaccines. We're also starting to see very positive data supporting effectiveness of some of the COVID-19 vaccines in other countries. Israel, which has had a very effective and aggressive rollout, has seen a precipitous decline in the number of hospitalizations, the number of severe cases, and in fact, the number of mildly symptomatic infections. Now, I do need to have one caveat there. Israel, at the time of the studies here, did not have high penetration of some of the new variants. So it'll remain to be seen how protective that is, and that'll be a good case study. Also good news, that more vulnerable groups and infections, like the elderly and other minority populations, really seem to be getting the equivalent protection as younger and let's say Caucasian and white populations. So that's good news for all these vaccines. The next slide, please. Now, these new, more contagious strains, I want to make sure everyone understands viruses mutate naturally. They try out new versions of themselves to gain a competitive advantage. We see this with the seasonal influenza. And one thing people may not be aware of is that the vaccines change from year to year based on the different A and B strains that are mutating and are thought to be the most prevalent strains. So this is not new news. And COVID-19 mutates more slowly than seasonal influenza strains. However, when you think about it, the virus has the higher likelihood of replicating or mutating when more people get infected. So when you have a high burden of disease, even though the mutation rate is slower, you're going to see a lot of mutations because there's a lot of opportunity. Now, there are at least 4 different variants that have what we call converging mutations of the COVID-19 spike protein. And that spike protein is what binds to human cells and allows the virus to enter our cells and infect us. And the strains are predominantly the UK strain, the South African strain, which is now increasingly being called by its name, B.1.351, and Brazil and USA strains that all seem to be more contagious than the previously circulating or original strains. Now, this isn't really surprising, and these strains are conceptually similar to the D614G mutation and later a MINC mutation that were discussed earlier in the pandemic, and which did seem to spread more easily than some of the earlier strains. Now, there is emerging evidence that the UK strain, that's B.1.1.7, might increase the mortality in people over 60. The data are still preliminary, but we're talking about an increase in deaths from 10 per 100,000 to 13. So it's still a 30% increase, but we're not talking about large numbers of people. Still though, it's something to pay attention to. And because the South African strain has several additional mutations, it's not just one mutation, but many that are converging on that spike protein, there has been some concern that it will be less affected by currently available vaccines, convalescent plasma, and monoclonal antibody drugs. And in fact, over the last week, there's good data that convalescent serum, plasma, and the monoclonal antibody drugs like those from Lilly and Regeneron really don't work very well against the South African strain. And I'd also want to go to the next slide and just talk a little bit about some data that was released yesterday. So I can go to the next slide. This is about B.1.351, the South African variant. Again, this has multiple mutations in the spike protein. It partially evades monoclonal antibodies and convalescent plasma. And now it's clear some vaccines. So there was a recent preliminary study of 2,000 people, unpublished, that was released yesterday by Witwatersrand University. It's suggesting that the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine that is being rolled out in the United Kingdom right now is less effective in stopping mildly symptomatic COVID-19 infections in young people. And the average age of the people studied was 31. So they paused the rollout in South Africa, and they're switching primarily to the Johnson & Johnson and Moderna vaccines that have been approved in that country for distribution. Now, some things the study didn't address. It did not address moderate to severe COVID-19 infections and was skewed to a young age, low risk group. So we really don't know how effective this vaccine might be in older populations or with severe disease. And there is some promise that the AstraZeneca-Oxford vaccine could be useful despite the pause, because neutralizing antibody activity of this vaccine was comparable to the Johnson & Johnson and Moderna vaccines when tested specifically against the South African B.1.351 strain. So it's less effective against the original strain, but still very good immune response. The AstraZeneca vaccine is highly effective against the original strains, but again, as the strains change, that may be less effective. So more work needs to be done. And I want to just highlight a couple of things. First of all, this gives us, I think, the best reason for continuing to practice social distancing, mask wearing, hand washing, respiratory hygiene, and the other precautions, because the virus is mutating. And our vaccine rollouts, even though they're better than they were before, are still relatively slow because of supply chain issues. So we've got to keep the number of opportunities for the virus to mutate low. So the fewer transmissions, the fewer individuals that are infected, the less likely it is for the viruses to continue to mutate. Also just want to have people exercise caution when thinking about vaccine effectiveness and comparing across different vaccine studies. You need to know when the study was done, because that's important for which strains were circulating and more prevalent at the time, where the study was done, the same reason, who it was done on, what population, and what was being measured. Was it severe disease? Was it mild disease? Or were there some other outcomes like the immune response measured by some in vitro assay that looks at antibody effectiveness against vaccines in a petri dish, or viruses in a petri dish. And with that, I'll turn it back over to David and Julia. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond, for such a comprehensive and important update. We're now nearly a year into the pandemic, and I want to thank you for all you are doing to keep us informed and to help keep us safe, and our employees and our community is also as safe as possible.
Thank you.
I'd now like to move to the formal business portion of our meeting. So Heather is screen sharing. So let me begin with pursuant to written notice previously mailed to all members, I hereby call to order the business portion of the 2021 annual meeting of the Greater Milwaukee Committee. The first item is approval of minutes. You have all received a copy of the minutes from the 2020 annual meeting. Do I have a motion to dispense with reading of the minutes? Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Okay, thank you. All in favor of dispensing with reading of the minutes, please raise your hand or say aye. All right, unanimous. Okay, the second item is the budget review. I'm happy to report that the GMC had a balanced budget in 2020, in large part due to receiving PPP loans, which are forgivable. The GMC also had an audit completed by Riley, Penner, and Benton, which was reviewed by the Finance Committee and approved by the board. The board also, and the Finance Committee also approved a balanced budget for 2021. So all of that is good news, and I'm happy to report. Lastly, dues notices have been mailed out to the members. So if all of you would be on the lookout for those and do your best to promptly pay them, that will aid in the cash flow of managing the GMC. What you now see on your screen is the proposed slate of directors, and the ones on the far right are up for re-election, including Betsy Brenner, Tina Chang, John Daniels Jr., Alan Gilligan, Cecilia Gore, Ted Kellner, Linda Mellows, and Wayne Morgan. So is there a motion to accept this slate and elect the 2024 directors for another term? Please raise your hand or say aye. All right, all in favor? Okay, I'm taking that as unanimous. All right, that completes the business portion of our meeting. And I'd now like to turn this back over to Julia.
Well, David, I want to extend a very sincere thank you for your leadership as chair of the GMC over the last 2 years. And what a 2 years it's been. Although your role as chairman ends after today's meeting, we're thankful that your engagement in the organization and on the board continues. You've been a guiding light during these past 2 years, especially during 2020 when COVID has upended all of our lives' normalcy. And you've supported me through broken ankles and surgeries, and you've always been there, always stepped up when I've asked for your help. I've greatly enjoyed working with you, and I know I speak for our team and our members as well. Your expert guidance through this pandemic and this time of racial reckoning have helped advance our work in remarkable ways. So we really appreciate you, David. We always try to find a special gift as well as a thank you. And Madeline helped us pick this gift out and is also helping us present it today.
I was wondering why she was standing over my shoulder.
Why is she hovering in my meeting?
Thank you, Madeline.
Okay, now you have to look. You want him to look now, right?
Yes, we want him to look, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Spin around.
We've heard that you're a bourbon fan.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
There are two cases
Special-
of this.
David, this is our mix, a bourbon from the GMC. And so we hope you'll enjoy this exceptional, one-of-a-kind Central Standard GMC bourbon. And extra thanks to Heather for all her help in designing, securing, and delivering this special gift. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Julia, and thank you to the membership and Heather and Madeline. And especially with this weather, I think bourbon is of even more importance. So I've enjoyed my role as chairman of the GMC. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve, and I look forward to continuing as a board member. So it's been very rewarding for me. Okay, so back to our agenda. And next is the prestigious Mary Ellen Stanek Award. And so I'd like to introduce Kim Stoll, who is chair-elect of Milwaukee Women, Inc., and Elmer Moore, executive director of GMC's Scale Up Milwaukee, to present the 8th annual Mary Ellen Stanek Awards for Diversity in Corporate Governance. So Kim and Elmer, it's yours.
Great. Thank you very much, David, and congratulations and thank you for your contributions. So the Mary Ellen Stanek Award for Diversity in Corporate Governance started 8 years ago to commemorate the outstanding contributions of its namesake. A collaboration between the Greater Milwaukee Committee and Milwaukee Women, Inc., the award has recognized the individuals and organizations whose deliberate efforts improve gender diversity, particularly on corporate boards. This year, the selection committee sought to also celebrate those who have also resulted in meaningful progress in both gender and racial diversity and representation in corporate governance. Heather, would you play the video?
The diversity of experience and the instincts gender diversity brings to the board is powerful.
Quite simply, diverse teams make better decisions.
Disruptive changes require disruptive and diversified thinking.
Companies that really can attract a diverse group of talented employees are the companies that are going to succeed.
Milwaukee Women, Inc. is an organization that is focused on gender diversity on boards of directors of Wisconsin companies. 2019 was an exciting year for board diversity in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin public companies exceeded the goal of 20% of gender diversity on their boards of directors.
Since having 3 women on our board, I think the quality of the discussions we've had around strategic issues has really been lifted.
There was a Catalyst study that showed the power of 3 being very impactful to boards of directors. Their research has shown that once you achieve at least 3 gender diverse individuals on that board of directors, the financial results far exceed those of companies with boards with less diversity.
45% of our board directors are women. What we've really seen is when you get a critical mass of 3, now you have a very diverse board with very diverse backgrounds and perspectives that can really help you make better business decisions.
We absolutely believe that having a diverse board contributes to the growth and profitability of the company.
Milwaukee Women Inc. Is very focused on talking about and sharing thoughts around best practices. One of the best practices that we see many companies using is creating a pipeline of diverse candidates.
When you nurture the pipeline, then you have a broad funnel of potential leaders, and so when opportunities arise in different parts of the world or different areas of your organization, you're ready to consider diverse candidates.
Historically, many companies have named either sitting CEOs or retired CEOs to their boards of directors. What we're finding is that a best practice is to look beyond that title and look at a specific skills matrix of different skill sets that the board of directors needs.
There's a few things that I think have helped me be successful on a public company board. The first is the experiences that I've gained in the company that I'm in today. Secondly, I think the diversity of my experience. I've been in sales, marketing, product development, product management, and that diversity brings a unique, diverse perspective to the corporate board. And then third, I've had the opportunity to be on nonprofit boards and industry association, and that has been a great experience for me to bring into a public company board.
There certainly is still work to be done. Our next goal is 25% gender diversity by 2025.
So if companies are able to tap into all of the talent pools that are available in the labor market, they are able to get the best of the potential that can help them achieve their business objectives.
This is such an exciting time. We see more and more women in the boardroom, see more women in the C-suite. We need to stay focused and we need to build on this momentum.
Okay, so I'm very proud here to talk about our first awardee for the 2021 Mary Ellen Stanek Award for Diversity in Corporate Governance. It goes to Ellen Gilligan, the President and CEO of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. Since her arrival in 2010, Ellen has shifted conversations of equity for both the foundation and numerous of her other organizations where she's had direct and indirect influence. She reshaped the gender and racial composition of GMF's board, which has 6 women directors and 6 directors of color. Under her leadership, the century-old organization has undertaken a generational commitment to racial equity. Ellen has advanced the cause of social justice, launching and supporting innovative efforts that encourage the necessarily discourse and policy changes to effect progress. Ellen is co-chair of Milwaukee United and lent her leadership to help launch the Thrive On collaboration in partnership with the Medical College of Wisconsin and Royal Capital Group. She holds multiple board seats, including the GMC, and she consistently tasks organizations with being equity forward. An exhaustive list of her achievements would not sufficiently describe the impact that she's had on our community. We appreciate and honor what Ellen has done to enhance equity, gender, and racial equity in all aspects of her life. Please join me in congratulating Ellen Gilligan, our 2021 Mary Ellen Stanek Award winner.
congratulations, Ellen. Our second award recipient is Manpower Group, an internationally recognized leader in diversity and inclusion practices. The company is also committed to gender parity and conscious inclusion, with 45% of the company's board of directors being female, which is an industry high. Additionally, women make up nearly 65% of the company and hold 59% of all management positions and 37% of senior leadership roles globally. Manpower Group remains committed to hiring, retaining, developing, and advancing more women into leadership and to progressing its goal of 40% women in leadership by 2024, a metric for which leaders are measured and held accountable. Jonas Priesing, Manpower Group's chairman and CEO, has committed to setting bold targets to increase representation of people of color at all levels, particularly in leadership and in delivery of service. In Milwaukee, the company is committed to achieving 15% and 25% representation in the total workforce and leadership levels, respectively, by 2025. For these achievements and for a history of equity commitment policies and actions, we're excited to recognize Manpower Group with the 2021 Mary Ellen Stanek Award for Diversity in Corporate Governance. Please join me in congratulating Manpower Group and Ellen Gilligan once again for their outstanding work. Ellen and Jonas, I hope you all can hear the claps and the cheers coming from each of the homes that everyone is watching. Congratulations again, and thank you. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Elmer, and congratulations to Ellen Gilligan and Manpower Group. And thank you for your leadership and commitment to diversity in corporate governance. Both Ellen and Manpower, under Jonas Priesing's leadership, are trailblazers in creating equitable organizations and community. And thank you to Milwaukee Women, Inc. for your continued partnership on this prestigious award. I'd now like to turn to our keynote speakers and introduce Rob Henken and Jason Stein of Wisconsin Policy Forum. Rob Henken is the president of Wisconsin Policy Forum, a position he has held since 2008. Since joining the forum, Rob has authored or co-authored 5 reports that won national awards from the Governmental Research Association. Rob was selected as the 2019 Person of the Year Award by the Milwaukee Rotary Club and received the 2019 Ally Award from the Hispanic Professionals of Greater Milwaukee. Before he became forum president, Rob worked in Milwaukee County government for nearly 10 years, serving as Director of Research for the County Board and Director of Health and Human Services and Director of Administrative Services. Prior to moving to Milwaukee in 1994, he worked for 7 years on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. as a senior aide to 2 congressmen and as staff director for a House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. So Rob is quite skilled and experienced. His associate, Jason Stein, is research director of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, where he focuses on state and local government out of the group's Madison office. Before joining the forum, Jason worked as a Capitol reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and the Wisconsin State Journal. He is the author, with Patrick Marley, of More Than They Bargained For, Scott Walker, Unions and the Fight for Wisconsin. And he's been recognized by many journalism groups across the country and the state. So today, Rob and Jason will share insight into their newest report, as you see on your screen, Dollar for Dollar, which is a deep dive into the spending side of the municipal budget equation and how Wisconsin state and local government compares to the nation. Following their presentation, there will be a panel of local elected officials, including Tom Barrett, Mayor of the City of Milwaukee, David Crowley, County Executive of Milwaukee County, Cavalier Johnson, President of Milwaukee Common Council, and Marcelia Nicholson, Chairman of Milwaukee County Board of Supervisors. So Rob and Jason, I'd like to now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations to you. You know, now that you have all this free time in your hands, maybe we'll have to recruit you for our board of directors. So maybe you'll be hearing from me. Also, congratulations to Ellen and Manpower for your honors. What we're going to do, Jason and I are going to tag team, give you a little bit of background information that will be pertinent to the panel discussion. Then we want to bring our elected leaders on, of course, to have that conversation. Also, please feel free to use the Q&A to submit any questions you may have. I can't promise that we'll get to all of them, but we can certainly try to get to a few. So I'm going to start off by just providing a little bit of background on sort of how we got to this report looking at local government spending. So let me try to advance my slides, which does not seem to be working. Give me 1 second, please. Here we go. So I think this is a report cover with which many of you are familiar. This is a report that the forum released in 2017. The Greater Milwaukee Committee sponsored it, and in fact has been a sponsor for all of the research that we'll be talking about. So thank you very much to the entire GMC for that. So On the Money was a report that really received a great deal of attention at the time. It dug very deeply into the revenue structure for the city of Milwaukee government and compared that to a bunch of peer cities. And what we found is captured on this slide. I don't think any of us were surprised, and my guess is that none of you in the audience would be real surprised to learn that Milwaukee has a lot of dependence on the property tax. But what this slide is showing, which we produced again in 2017, is that at that time, as if you looked at the property tax as a share of local tax revenue for a group of 39 peer cities. So this peer group is every city in the United States with a population between 300,000 and 1 million. We did have to exclude a handful that either were combined city-county governments or that also financed their school districts. But we had a nice, healthy peer group, as you can see on this slide, of 39. And what we are looking at here is property tax as a share of all local tax revenue. And what stands out, of course, is that not only is Milwaukee #1 among the 39 in terms of its reliance on the property tax, but it's #1 by a very wide margin. And really, I could argue that this 96% that you're seeing should be 100% because business improvement and tax incremental district funding comprises a large portion of that remaining 4%, and arguably those are also derived from the property tax. So what we see here is that not only are we heavily reliant on the property tax, but we are certainly unique in that regard among similar sized peer cities across the country. Where we are also unique, here we're not #1, but we're #3, is in the dependence that our city government has on revenue from the state of Wisconsin. And most of that revenue comes from the state's shared revenue program. As you can see, when you look at state funding as a share of combined intergovernmental and local tax revenues, we're at 48%. Again, not #1, #3, and far above the average of this peer group. Why is this problematic? Well, it's a lot of money. And so the city's shared revenue payment from the state is about close to $230 million per year. The problem is that amount of money has not gone up in at least 20 years. So again, on the one hand, there's this very heavy reliance. On the other hand, reliance on a funding source that simply hasn't grown over time. So those are some key distinctions that we looked at with regard to the city of Milwaukee. We wanted to take our research then a step further. We wanted to look at, in general, the municipal revenue structure in the state of Wisconsin and how Wisconsin compared to the other 49 states. So we looked in this study that came out in 2019 called Dollars and Cents at the revenue structure for municipalities as a whole. We're presenting it a little differently in this slide. This is looking at each of these revenue sources as a share of the total. But as you can see, what is consistent is that when compared to the US average, municipal governments in the state of Wisconsin far more reliant on property taxes, far less reliant on sales taxes. What's interesting here is when you look across the municipalities, unlike just the city of Milwaukee, our dependence on state aid is much closer to the US average. But still, this reliance on the property tax and very little use of other sources of local taxation clearly is a finding that was retained as we spread it across all municipalities, in this case, cities and villages, actually, not towns, in the state of Wisconsin. So as we put out both of these reports, one of the common questions that we got asked in response was, okay, Wisconsin Policy Forum, you've pointed out some distinctions in terms of our revenue structure, but what about the spending side? How do we compare to other states when it comes to spending? And before you tell us that we have a revenue problem that ought to be addressed, what can you tell us about whether we also have a spending problem? And so that leads us to a report that we released last month. I'm now going to turn it over to Jason Stein, our research director, to walk you through very briefly some findings from that report.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And thanks to the GMC for both having us here and to talk about this research and for sponsoring it in the first place. So when we look at local and government spending in Wisconsin, the first thing you have to understand is you really can't look at it in isolation. And the reason is simple. Every state has a little different breakdown in terms of responsibility at the state and local level for services like parks, police, libraries, things like that. And what you really care about is what is the level of service and what is the cost of the service to the public, as opposed to which level of government is actually delivering it. And so that was something that we tried to control for or account for as we did our study. And you can see more what I mean by that as I go along in the presentation. Okay, quickly, the report has an introduction. It has a historical analysis that basically looks at, most of my lifetime, what's been happening for spending in certain key areas in Wisconsin by local governments in Wisconsin. Then we look at 2017 data, which is a year from the Census Bureau that you can get very complete and accurate data for. It does a comparison of local and state spending in Wisconsin to other states around the country. And then there's a discussion of, well, what does this all mean? What are the implications? What are things that policymakers should consider as they go into things like the state budget that's about to really kick off next week? So here you see state and local spending in Wisconsin over, the last generation. And what you see is that the gap between the share of that spending has really narrowed as the state has started to take on more and more of the overall spending, and local governments are taking less. This is not the amount of the spending. This is the amount of the spending has been going up because of inflation and other factors, but this is what is the breakdown of it. Obviously, there's a number of things that are happening here. There are levy limits on property taxes. There are school revenue limits. Those have had a big impact in terms of slowing local spending growth. The state has had greater growth in taxes like the income tax and spending pressures in certain areas like Medicaid in particular. And so those are some of the things that are happening there. You go ahead to the next slide. It is worth noting that even though the state has really almost caught up to local governments in terms of the share of overall spending in Wisconsin, we are still somewhat unusual nationally in relying more on local governments than the state government to deliver key services. And again, that is what we really care about, is the overall spending and level of service. But you can see here that for both local and state spending, we are below average in Wisconsin. Our ranking is a little bit higher at the local level than at the state level, but we are below the national average for both, and in the roughly middle of the pack for states. Okay, so here's a slide that really helps you when you say, well, Jason, what does it mean to say that our state relies more on local governments to deliver key services? This is a great example. So what this is per capita spending on police at the state and local level combined by state. And what you can see is that Wisconsin ranks 23rd overall, but within that very middle of the pack ranking at the state local level, there's a real variation in terms of levels of government. So you can see that at the municipal level, Wisconsin ranks 8th highest nationally for spending on police. And at the state level, we rank dead last. And so when you combine those two things, we're average, but we get to sort of an average spending in a very unusual way. And why would this matter? I mean, this could matter, you know, in the context of after the killing of George Floyd, you had some discussion about how much cities like the city of Milwaukee spend on police protection. And obviously that's an important debate to have. But one key piece of context to understand is when you're thinking about how much do we as a society in Wisconsin or in the greater Milwaukee area spend on police, that although it's high for, you know, the level of cities and villages, it tends to be much lower at the state level and so forth. And you see this with some other the services like parks would be another example of that. Okay, just to keep this moving, our spending is also affected by some of the, you know, unique geography and culture of Wisconsin. Here you see police departments, you know, per capita spending on police departments and the share of fire departments in a state that are volunteer. And you see that our spending is low on fire and EMS services in Wisconsin, and our percentage of volunteer fire departments is high. So that gives us low spending. Now, if you have a huge fire in your small rural community, or you have several people that are having heart attacks at once, you know, there's implications for the kind of service you're going to get at those difficult times, but it is cheaper. Other things, we have winter weather in Wisconsin, very harsh, that we're really feeling that this week. That tends to really increase spending on roads. And then we also have other things like, you know, our communities are pretty evenly distributed around the state. We have a high share of high number of rural road miles. All those things can impact spending. Okay, so what should we take away from all this? Well, you know, one thing to think about as we put more and more, I think, pressure on revenues and spending at the local level, that to remember that those are the very government entities that we are depending on to deliver services like libraries, like police, fire, parks, that sort of thing. So if they're, you know, the state government in Wisconsin does not have a big institutional role right now where it could take any of the pressure off those local governments. Certainly, as policymakers, one thing that lawmakers and the governor could consider is having this, you know, government take on more responsibility in those areas, or in, you know, some of those areas. Wouldn't have to be all of them. That would be certainly one option. And I think, as you know, the Policy Forum doesn't advocate for or against specific policies, but we try and offer thoughtful suggestions. Another option that obviously has gotten a lot of, I think, consideration from the people on this call is the idea of a local option sales tax or other steps that you could do to increase revenues at the local level. Obviously, as we have a number of local governments in Wisconsin, we're high for just simply how many local governments we have. So that is also something to think about in terms of service sharing and local collaboration, which is something that Rob has done a ton of research on at the Policy Forum. We can look at ways at the state level to incentivize cooperation at the local level, or at the very least, to not have disincentives to cooperation at the state level. And then finally, one thing that I always point out is, as policymakers, state and local officials always have the option of doing nothing, but there's sometimes a fallacy that if we do nothing, we'll get the status quo, will just continue forever. Well, obviously that's not the case, because things go on and change whether government acts or not. And what I think you could potentially see is a continued increase in reliance on the property tax at the local level, as well as continued pressure on services like police and libraries, if we have these trends continue on as they have. So thanks very much, and we'll take questions if there are any.
So Heather, I think if we stop sharing the screen, we can bring the panelists out. And actually, again, we urge you to submit any questions that you may have, either for the forum or for our panelists. My sense is you may have more questions for them once they come on. In the meantime, I'm going to get started by moderating some discussion with our very illustrious panel of leaders from our city government and our county government. So welcome, panelists. I'm going to dispense with any more formal introductions. I know everybody knows who all of you are. Let's get right to the questions. And let's get started with your reaction to the findings that Jason just described regarding the forum's latest report. I think what it really highlights is sort of this double whammy faced by local governments, particularly your two governments in the state of Wisconsin. Very limited local revenue options, yet very heavy local government responsibilities. Sort of counterintuitive, the two of them. So I'm wondering, first of all, were you surprised at that finding, particularly when we compared our governments to the rest of the country? And how does that finding impact your pitch to the state for a local option sales tax? So that's my question. Mayor Barrett, I'm going to start with you. No offense, but you've been grappling with these issues for a little bit longer than your colleagues. So let's hear from you first.
Well, thank you very much, Robin. Thank you for the great report, and congratulations to the award winners. And David, congratulations to you for your service to the organization. Everything was fine till you got here, just so you know. But congratulations. So was I surprised? No, I wasn't surprised. There were a couple of things that surprised me a little bit. My overall reaction is sort of the guy who died, and on his tombstone he has inscribed, "I told you I was sick." Because we have been saying for years that the fiscal relationship between the city of Milwaukee and state government is broken, and we need to set the reset button. And I know the county is facing different problems, but also some serious problems. And so we have literally for years been trying to make the case that this just is not working. I would say the two things that jumped out at me, and I don't know if you can bring up the slide again real quickly, but the slide that shows that we're, I think, 12th in the country in local spending for police, yet 50th for state spending on police. And health, I think we were relatively high for local spending, I think 6th highest for local spending, and then 48th highest on state spending. So it tells you that these two incredibly vital functions, public safety and health, local government is carrying the load. And we've seen absolutely no help in terms of an increase from state government in these two critical areas. And so for the last couple of sessions, when I've gone to the state legislature, I haven't gone there to make threats. I haven't gone there to blow smoke. I have simply gone there to tell them, look, this is our situation. If we don't get additional revenue, we are going to have fewer police officers. One year it was 80 fewer police officers. This year it was 120 fewer police officers. And so those were not philosophical decisions, those were fiscal decisions. So the city of Milwaukee has 200, this year, at the end of this year, we'll have 200 fewer police officers than it did just 3 years ago. And that tells you the impact this is having. And it's not only that area, but it's an area of health, it's an area of housing, where we're at a point now where we look to the federal government more for assistance than we do for state government. And I think that that's a sad statement.
So let me turn to you now, and thank you, Mayor Barrett, County Executive Crowley. So you obviously came to your position from state government. You've been engaged with colleagues on both sides of the aisle in that position, talking about some of Milwaukee County and City of Milwaukee's unique problems. A report now comes out that would appear to indicate that when it comes to spending, we're roughly middle of the pack. Do you think that that will surprise your colleagues? And what do you think that this research, again, what type of impact does this have on your ability now to try to get something done in this next state budget regarding some type of fiscal relief?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the report, Rob, the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Thank you, GMC. Congratulations to David, chairing your last meeting, and congratulations to Ellen and Manpower as well. But honestly, when you look at this report, this really reinforces what we already know. And I think it would, many of my colleagues would say they've been doing everything to keep spending down at the state level, but it's not trickling down to everybody else. And so, in the past 10 plus years, you have seen many communities across the state of Wisconsin go to a binding referendum to increase their property taxes because they know that there is a need to invest locally. And so there is a statewide need for more local options, and the financial challenges that are facing communities like ours. But when you think about all the large and small communities, urban or rural, they have a real impact on how each of us seeks to invest in our local priorities. And so we have to remember that Wisconsin counties are very unique compared to other counties across the country, as you pointed out, which is we require counties to provide both local and state services. And this has a disproportionate impact on Wisconsin counties, especially right now when you think about us responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. But this also gives us a lot of limitations because we don't have the ability to raise revenue to really meet these growing needs. And so we are unable to proactively invest in the programs and services that could literally not only mitigate this pandemic, but really put people in a prime position to thrive. And so this is something that we're going to have to continue to talk to the Republican-controlled legislature about, as well as the governor administration, about the need for local governments needing more dollars.
Thank you. Council President Johnson, I want to turn to you. I'm interested not only in your general reaction to the report, but in particular, I'd be interested in your comments on the slide that Jason showed regarding police spending that the mayor mentioned as well. The finding that, again, when you look at municipal police spending, we certainly seem to be on the high side as a state in terms of our overall municipal spending. That doesn't speak specifically to the city, but clearly the city Milwaukee police budget is a big part of overall state municipal spending on police. How does that impact the conversations that are taking place right now at City Hall regarding the future of the police budget and whether there may be some opportunity to do some things in terms of diverting some funds to some other purposes?
Well, thank you, Rob, for the question. And as the county executive and the mayor said, congratulations to all the winners there, and to David on successful 2 years of chairing the GMC. My general reaction to the report was that it wasn't really all that surprising because we've been singing this tune for some years now about the need for greater state support and flexibility for local revenues. We constantly speak in terms of how Milwaukee is an outlier, really, in terms of large American cities, and that our state government is unique and that it starves us to keep pace with raising revenues to deliver services that our citizens both expect as well as deserve. In relation to the police spending, that's an excellent question. The mayor was mentioning this during our own budget process, and where we had a lot of pressure from community groups to defund the police or abolish the police or significantly reduce police spending to the tune of $75 million, which in essence would have cut the police department in Milwaukee in half. What he had said was that essentially the state government has already taken up that mantle of defunding the police by the mere fact that they are not making sure that local governments in Wisconsin, and namely the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County, have the revenue options necessary to keep up with the cost to continue services, including for police funding. So in terms of the state funding piece for police, that certainly is an area where they could step in and help local governments, especially ours, to be able to relieve some of the financial pressures that we face, and not just in police, but in so many other areas as well, as identified in the report too. Housing, economic development, as it relates to counties, parks, so many other areas where the state could step in and be a real partner for us at the local level.
Thank you, President Johnson. And last but certainly not least on this question, Chairwoman Nicholson, again, interested in any general response you have to the report, and also interested in your perceptions of just what type of response you think, first of all, that you've been getting so far and that you're anticipating. As Jason said, new state budget coming out next week. What's the state of affairs in your opinion in terms of your ability to talk to Madison and try to work collaboratively on some relief?
Thank you, Rob, and your staff for this report. I just want to start by thanking the Greater Milwaukee Committee for this honor of addressing you and your guests, and then also extending congratulations to Dave and Ellen. Thank you for all your amazing work in the community. So as it relates to this question, what I want to start with is our community deserves better than austerity cuts and being taxed to death. And I think we've made that known in our ask to state legislators. The report was not surprising to me. I'm aware of the long structural problems Milwaukee County has had that precedes me, even my birth at only 32 years old. But the last 5 years of my own involvement in Milwaukee County as a policymaker, we've had to cut important services annually to make our budgets whole. And we've also seen the impacts that increased spending and reduced shared revenue has had on our structural deficit long term. What I want to say I was surprised to hear was that we rank in the middle of the road, but I understand that it accounts for local spending and reduced and not enough state spending. But I was surprised to see that, because the perception in Milwaukee is that we invest too much in urban communities. We invest too much in public services and not enough in enterprise or the private sector. So I thank you all for this well-reasoned, apolitical, very forward and succinct report that now gives us the data and the evidence that we need to take back to the state legislature and say, listen, roll back preemptive measures so that we can be innovative in local government, increase state shared revenue, and take on some of the responsibilities of funding important services that this entire state gets to interact with here in Milwaukee County and our local economy. But in terms of what I'm hearing, we were very fortunate to receive CARES funding this past budget cycle. And the community was very pleased to hear that instead of cutting essential services, we were able to add into and improve some of those services. But because we did not get that direct and flexible funding, and as Mayor Barrett said, because we have to consistently lobby the federal government for more funding, I'm afraid, and our constituents are afraid of what our budget will look like next year. But I'm optimistic, and I'm looking forward to working with the group of leaders on the call to make sure that we can get it done for Milwaukee County.
Thank you, Chairwoman Nicholson. And it provides a good segue into my next question. You mentioned the CARES funds, which for those in the audience who aren't aware, that's one of the primary forms of relief that the federal government sent down to states and to local governments. Let's stick with the county first. So a question for the Chairwoman and the county executive. When we assessed your budget for the 2021 budget last fall, sort of pleasantly surprised that because of those CARES funds, particularly for your transit system, but also for some other sources, you sort of, again, appeared to have sort of a reprieve, at least for the time being. We and others, many of your predecessors have now been warning for years about the real consequences if nothing changes for the county budget, yet it seems like every year somehow you find a way to scrape by. So can you just share with us a little bit just how dire is your financial situation, and what's the outcome if there is not some type of relief, either through the state taking on greater responsibilities, as Jason mentioned, or again, providing some type of new local tax option or some other form of relief. So maybe let's start with you, County Executive Crowley. We'll then go back to you, Chairwoman Nicholson.
Great question. But when you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, it has really made the need for additional revenue even more urgent. I mean, when you think about this unprecedented challenge that we're all facing to keep our neighbors and our businesses safe, it's really shown that our funding structure, our revenue structure is extremely unsustainable. And it's really painted that picture. And we have to maintain a balanced budget. And so we need that additional revenue. We need that flexibility so we can provide the county government the stability that it requires to pay for the necessary service that so many folks need right now, not only just to address this pandemic, but through the recovery. And so, you know, this year we were able to plug our budget, but you have to remember year after year, Milwaukee County can see anywhere between $20 to a $30 million deficit. And we aren't seeing an increase in revenues. With everything that is shut down, we're not seeing program revenues or usual streams of revenues coming in that we usually see. And so we're going to have to rely heavily on both the state and federal government to help us get through this pandemic and through this recovery. But it's just to let folks know that we need more tools. You know, right now we're talking about the pandemic, but it does not mean that all of the issues facing even previous to this pandemic. I don't know why I am a little nervous today, but previous to this pandemic, but even now, you know, it's really exacerbated many of the issues that we have seen. And if we want to invest our dollars towards racial equity and health equity, it's going to take us having more tools in the toolbox to do exactly that. Especially as you mentioned, when you talk about our transit system, our mental health system, when you think about our park system, these are programs and services that many people need access to. And right now we're in a tough position to where we're going to have to make a lot of tough choices in the near future without a local option 1% sales tax.
And Chairwoman Nicholson, just would ask you to briefly weigh in on that one as well. But also, is this the year that the parks really needs to take the hit, being one of the few discretionary programs and services left in county government?
Thank you, Robin. I'm glad you mentioned it, and I will be brief. But County Executive, I don't know why you're nervous, because this is like, you're amazing at this. So, but very briefly, I think the County Executive put it in a nutshell. But we basically have a structural deficit issue that's baked into a system of inflation, where inflation increases twice the amount that our revenue does. And so, because we only have property taxes, fees, and services to rely on to fund our services, it really does put us at a disadvantage. It is important to note, though, because, and I read this in the report, because Wisconsin does rely on property taxes, our budget during the pandemic was a little bit more stable than other local governments would have had. However, we really need to stop overtaxing our community in order to publicly fund our services. In terms of parks, I'm glad you mentioned that, because parks is one of those departments that have moved towards a revenue model where a majority of their budget comes from revenue that they raise from parks facilities, from events, from rentals, etc. But because of the pandemic, there was no use there. And so we were not able to raise the revenue. And that puts right there a spotlight on the type of structural deficit that we have that is long-term and is only exacerbated by the pandemic. So I really do think the state legislature should heed our call and really focus on this report and take to heart the recommendations that you put forth, because that's really what we're going to need. Those increased, you know what, I'll use a word for the business community, diversify. We need to diversify our revenue streams so that we can have a sustainable county government.
Thank you. So let's turn back to our city leaders. City was not as fortunate as the county in terms of the degree of difficulty of your 2021 budget. So you got through it. Obviously, there was an impact on police department staffing, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg. You face a huge potential increase in your pension contribution coming up as soon as 2023. So let's start with you, Mayor Barrett. I mean, what are the consequences if nothing changes in terms of your overall financial dynamic?
Well, we're already seeing the consequences in several different areas. One that I think many of the people in your audience here would understand is, and I hate saying this, as the mayor of the city of Milwaukee, we saw our Standard & Poor's rating drop 2 notches. And no mayor wants to ever talk about that, because it means that we are clearly distressed. And if you look at the causes of the distress, they point to our economy. They point to the fact that we're operating on a deficit in the general fund. And that's happening because we're drawing down on our reserves. And as you said in your initial comments, when you have one of your two major funding streams stagnant for 20 years, of course that's going to have an impact. It would have an impact on any single organization that anyone in this room is operating. You simply cannot have that major source of revenue stagnant for 20 years. And when I say stagnant, I'm not talking about growing at the rate of inflation or things like that. I'm saying it's not growing at all, period. So you've got that, and then you've alluded to our pension issue that's coming up in 2023. And the criticism of us is that we lack a plan to sufficiently address the obligation. And that's true, because we clearly have to partner with the state to be able to come up with the tools to address this. We legally do not have the tools to address these issues right now. So we are now at the point where this is not a decade off, it's not 5 years off. This is all coming in the next year or two where it's going to come to a head. So my hope is that the business community and the people who are part of GMC will partner with us. And I think the value of this report, far beyond anything else, it's obviously, it's credible, but you have the integrity and the believability. When I go there, or when other city or county leaders go there, they sort of don't hear us anymore. Your voice can still be heard, and that's why it's such a powerful voice.
Thanks, Mayor Barrett. President Johnson, how do you size up for your constituents and for your colleagues on the Common Council, many of whom are relatively new? You know, what's within your power to try to fix here, such as the pension problem, versus where you just need help from state government?
Yeah, thank you. I think no matter if you are new or if you're a veteran on the Common Council, when you mention the year 2023, it's a looming date that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you are in a leadership position in city government. And it does that because we unfortunately have been put into a position where our backs are up against the wall. And we've tried to continue to have these sort of conversations, and we need to continue to have these conversations to try to get the state to be able to come to the table to help the city of Milwaukee to address this mounting pension obligation, this mounting pension issue. But as was stated, I mean, there's no way that we can overcome this hurdle without true and significant partnership from state government. And so that's the message that I carry on myself, that members of the council understand too, is that, you know, we're in a really tough spot. And in order for us to be removed from that spot, we need the folks, you know, in charge that could give us the tools to fix this problem, to actually be there to help us to do it. You know, it's one thing to point fingers and say, you know, we don't like the city's doing X, Y, or Z. But these are real and serious issues that are going to impact service delivery. And without action on them, we're going to be in a position where, you know, service delivery continues to get cut for the Wisconsin residents who live here, the full 10% of the state's population that lives within the corporate limits of the city of Milwaukee. And I think it's unfair to those folks to not be able to get the services that they both expect and deserve because the state is, you know, taking some sort of position with the city of Milwaukee where they don't want to help for some reason or another, be it political or otherwise. So we've got to continue to make sure that that message is known and try to work with the state to make sure that they can be the partners that they need to be, that we need them to be, that these citizens in our city need them to be in order to solve these problems.
We are running out of time, so I want to leave with one last question. I'm going to have to ask each of you to be brief, which is not going to be fair once you hear my question. But it strikes me, I've been at this for a very long time, and I can't remember the last time that 3 of the 4 top positions in our city and county were by people, filled by people who are new to those positions, who are young, who are African American. And one of the things that has always frustrated me in the forum is there have been times where there hasn't been great cooperation between the city and the county. So in 20 seconds or less for each of you, we'll go back in reverse order, start with Chairwoman Nicholson. Very, very quickly, how do you assess the relationship between the city and the county, and are you encouraged that this could be an era of new cooperation between the two governments?
Rob, this is a new era of local government. I am elated to be serving amongst this slate of leadership. I will state that in terms of collaboration and service sharing, Milwaukee Task Force I proposed last spring. I hope now that we have more data and information that we can use that as a vehicle to collaborate more across the city of Milwaukee and within the Milwaukee Public Schools District. But yes, it is a new era of government, a new style of leadership. There's lots to come, and I'm very optimistic for the future. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Let's go to you next, President Johnson.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rob. I fully concur with the comments by Chairwoman Nicholson. Look, we know each other. We're friends. You know, the three of us who are millennials, who are the principal leaders here in Milwaukee County. There's nothing but upside in the future for us to be able to work together. And I think, outside of that, there have been areas where the city and the county have historically worked well together. For instance, in conveyance of tax foreclosed properties, newer ways in terms of the CART program where we pair law enforcement with mental health professionals, the doula program, and others. But there are some other places too that I think in the future we'll be able to work together even more so on infrastructure, perhaps even snow removal, things like that. And I've got no doubt that we'll be able to put things together when we work together.
Great.
Thanks for having us, Rob.
County Executive Crowley.
Well, I'm just ecstatic about having a working relationship with both the chairwoman, the president, and the mayor. I talk to at least one of them on a regular basis, all of them on a regular basis, to be quite frank with you. And so I'm really excited about the partnership, and I have to thank the mayor for his partnership and leadership as we continue to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, but also as we think about the One Milwaukee, Move Milwaukee Forward coalition. We've been partnering with the city, other municipalities, as well as business leaders and community leaders about the need that we all have in increasing our revenue. So I'm really excited, not only just about this particular initiative, but others to come.
Thank you. And Mayor Barrett, you get the last word.
Well, first of all, I'm a little offended you don't consider me young, but I'll let that go. I'll let that go. But I love the energy. Obviously, there's a lot of energy, and it is accurate to say that we work well together right now. And I just hope the honeymoon continues. Again, I think the more we can speak with one voice, the stronger we are. And that's always what I wanted to do, was to be able to have the city and the county coming together, because I think there is such a mutuality in our interests that it makes sense for us to act together.
Thank you. And thank you, all of our panelists. Thanks again to the GMC. And I'll turn it back to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Rob. I want to thank you and Jason and our elected officials for sharing this important information. This is an urgent issue. It's been a priority of the GMC for several years. I think the fact that we have 3 young millennials and new leadership is bringing some added energy. We are in touch with the governor on this issue. We're working now with outstate elected officials to make this a statewide issue, not a Milwaukee City and County issue. And it is something that we feel change needs to occur in the next year or two. Politics is difficult and challenging, but if we collaborate and really work closely together, hopefully success will be ahead of us. So thank you very much. I need to ask Heather to screen share. There's one issue for the membership to vote on that I missed in our earlier discussion, and that's a change in the bylaws. And this came about in a recent discussion, in a recent board meeting, where we're talking about increasing the size of the board for a number of reasons, but one in particular is to help the GMC achieve its goals in racial equity and diversity. These are not positions that are specified for any specific race or demographic, but it will help the GMC when bringing on additional board members to achieve its overall racial equity and diversity goals. So it's here on the board. We're increasing it to not more than 40. Is it 40? Is that right?
uh,
The language, so right here, the board shall be comprised of not more than 29 directors.
from 25 to 29?
Right.
Okay, so we're going from 25 to 29 directors, and this will all work through the nominating committee and then the board and then back to the membership. But we need to change our bylaws. So is there a motion to accept this? Someone could raise their hand or say aye.
So moved.
Okay, a second? Any discussion? All in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, this passes. All right, so again, I want to thank the panelists and our speakers, and congratulations to Ellen Gilligan and Manpower Group. The next membership meeting will be in March, and Greg Marcus will be the chairman. And that brings us to the end of this meeting. If the directors of the GMC could stay on, there is just a small bit of business that'll take a few minutes when we conclude the membership meeting. Otherwise, everyone, do your best to stay warm, stay healthy, and we'll see you in March.